Welcome to the second session. So we're turning this time from AI to start to look at connectivity, another important topic, and clearly something that you have to have before you can even have AI to do most activities, since if you can't communicate, you can't actually engage with any kind of intelligence. So this session is Mind the Connectivity Gap, and we're looking in particular at developing countries and looking at the role that a wide range of different technologies, 5G, Wi-Fi, satellite, and other forms of connectivity can have in making sure that those who are unconnected can be connected and those who have poor connections can get better connections. Of course, this is not a new topic. We've had unconnected people, sadly, for many decades. And over the years, much has improved. We've seen gradual rollout of better and more extensive cellular networks in many countries. We've seen improving fixed networks. But of course, there's still an awful lot to do. We've seen a lot of great initiatives, some of which have been successful. There's been, for example, quite a lot of the community Wi-Fi and similar kind of activities that have really helped. And we've seen a lot of activities that have either failed or been partially successful. Things like Google's Loon Balloon project, which got off the ground but only briefly, and things like Microsoft's use of TV whitespace, something I was actually quite involved in, which has delivered some benefits, but I think nothing like what was hoped at the time. So there's still a lot to do, and it's a moving target, of course, because what was thought of as sufficiently connected 10 years ago is now insufficient as everyone's expectation of data rates and of usage and applications grows all the time. So we need to move fast to hit that particular target. So what we're going to be talking about today is what should that target be? Who should be paying to hit that target where it's not economic for the commercial sector to provide it? What kind of technology should we be using to deliver that? And more generally, kind of how can we make this fair? How can we ensure that good outcomes for countries, for humanity, really transpire? So I'm going to introduce each of our four panelists, give them each a chance to just make a minute or two of opening remarks, and then we'll dive into some questions. And just like the previous panel, I'll ask questions for a while and then turn it over to you. So please do think of questions, write them down, and we'll come to those later on in the session. So let's start on the far side with H. Samanwana. H is the managing partner at Synerva, a London-based consultancy specialising in technology, media and telecommunications regulatory matters across emerging markets and in training digital economy regulators and operators. He's held key positions at Ofcom, where we work together, at Arqiva, at Quadrica, and is a respected author with two notable books on telecoms and technology for emerging economies. H, do you want to make a few opening remarks?
First, I'm very honored to be invited here, so thank you to Access Partnership and Greg and William and Peter. So thank you so much for being here. I think the connectivity problem, particularly for the emerging markets, at any time, Synerva is always working with no less than 10 to 15 emerging market countries, low income, low middle income countries at any time. And the connectivity problem, I think, is still quite endemic. So if we take sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where I originally come from, I come from Cameroon, you still got the 17% coverage gap problem there, and you still got a more than 60% affordability gap problem in Africa. So it's a really big problem, both this demand side, on the supply side, as well as on the demand side. And we really need to look for all the different connectivity solutions to try and bridge those the demand and supply gaps in Africa, for example. I'm also working in Papua New Guinea, much worse, right? Much worse. Papua New Guinea is probably only about 20-30% connected right now. It's quite low. Thank you.
Thank you, H. On H's left is Mark Williams. Mark is the founder of Throughline Advisors. He's an economist with 24 years of experience in competition, regulation and strategy, with a particular focus on the media and telecom sector. His consulting work has included mobile sector liberalisation, spectrum policy, competition investigations, price controls, merger controls and litigation. He's worked around the world advising companies, regulators and governments. He previously spent 8 years working at the World Bank, where he was responsible for the organisation's policy and strategy for mobile. And he and I colluded on a report on 5G during that time. In addition to his advisory work, he teaches university courses at UCL, University of Johannesburg, and the University of Chicago, amongst others. Mark, your thoughts?
Thanks, William. Yeah, just a very few brief remarks. I'm now at the stage of my career when I can look back over, a quarter of a century of this, and going back to, well, when I first started my first job was in Uganda, and I was living in Uganda in the mid-1990s when MTN launched, and that was, for those of you who remember, was sort of revolutionary because it was the first time that a mobile operator had really launched in a big way outside of South Africa, the first time in sub-Saharan Africa. And it was a wild success. So now, 25 years later, we've been through sort of 3 technology cycles, and there was a lot of hype around 5G and how it was going to transform emerging markets. And when William and I were working on this, looking at it, our sort of basic conclusion, very simply, was we have seen this before, and it will bring a lot of benefits to emerging markets. And the recipe for how to maximize those benefits, is pretty similar to what it was for 4G, 3G, and even before that, 2G. But it's not necessarily politically simple to achieve those benefits. Actually, there's a lot of trade-offs within governments, and that's why you see a fairly sort of imperfect or patchy developments of ICT across emerging markets. But if we can look back at those lessons and apply them going forward, and not just to mobile, but also to fiber, Wi-Fi, other types of technology, there is a lot of prospect for success. And as H says, it will definitely deliver benefits to those countries.
Thank you, Mark. Next up is Pamela Guidi. Pamela is a trailblazer in Chile's telecoms and technology sector. As the former Undersecretary of Telecommunications, she led a successful 5G spectrum auction and championed responsible tech integration of cybersecurity. She's a respected public speaker and board member and has earned prestigious awards for her leadership as a prominent female figure in Chile. Her insightful columns reinforce her influence in tech and business community. Pamela,
thank you, Access Partnership, for an invitation. I'm delighted about speaking on this topic because I believe for me it was a gift to be able to be a vice minister and really touch the lives of people. I really understand that connectivity is about human rights. It's the biggest source, or one of the biggest sources of social mobility, as much as education and entrepreneurship. And when we talk about the previous panel, problems of the ethics of AI, of cybersecurity, and so on, we believe that sometimes we forget that that's the problem of the luckiest, right? There's the people that don't have those problems because they don't have access at all. And I'm working on that and trying to help Latin America, and especially for rural areas, but also the vulnerable groups of people, the poor, the elderly, and definitely the women. So lucky to be here and pursue the importance and work all together, because I think, as Mark was saying, the recipes are the same on the previous technology, and it's about collaboration. 4.0 economics is about collaboration more than ever, and this forum is about collaboration as well.
Thank you, Pamela. And last but not least is Diego Milano Vega, the former Minister of Information Technologies and Communications of Colombia, where he created the Plan Vive Digital, probably not pronounced correctly, a national technology strategy that transformed Colombia and led the country to obtaining the GSMA's Government Leadership Award. His main driver is expanding technology to reduce poverty. For more than 30 years, he's worked designing and executing telecom technology policy in more than 20 countries, serving as a senior advisor to McKinsey, the Inter-America Development Bank, and the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., amongst others. Diego, your thoughts?
Thank you so much for having me today. It is really a pleasure to be here to talk about this quite old topic, because I've been discussing about connectivity all my life since I left school. Actually, since my first experience in telecommunications in my little hometown in the mountains of Colombia, my grandmother used to be the telegraphist of the town. And my grandfather was the telegraphist of the town, the next town, and there was no road to connect them. My grandfather would walk every day to his job. And my first memories in telecom were helping my grandmother delivering telegrams in the town. And that really triggers me the passion for this, to expand technology, because I saw from that moment the impact of technology in people's lives. And the world, humanity is going to change in the next 20 years more than it has changed so far in the whole history. Are we ready for this? And unfortunately, what we are seeing today is that we are not ready, especially the developing countries. The gap is growing dramatically right now. And the first issue to close the gap is what Pamela said. This is about people. This is not about technology. It is about people. We need urgently 4 types of new talents. Of course, the first one, coders. Okay, we need to promote coding. In just Latin America, we have right now 1.2 million jobs available for coders, and we don't have them. Of course, there is a huge demand there. But that's not only the issue. We need women, massively women in this sector. And this is not about a gender equality thing. Okay, this is not a gender equality. It is because we need their skills to be successful. The third type of talent we need is that every single professional, it was mentioned before in the previous panel, we need doctors, accountants, lawyers that understand this new world. And I've been a president of a university in different countries for more than 6 years. I know the education system, we have to change it. But if we assess today in Latin America, the people who are just graduating from the elite schools in Latin America, from medicine, from law, they have no clue about this new world. So even the elite is not being prepared for this change, And so we need everybody to be part of this. But the talent we lack the most is leadership. Leadership for both the private and the public sector. And it is urgent to create that talent, and starting with ourselves. We have to prepare ourselves for this transition. So thank you so much, and I look forward to a quite interesting debate here.
Great, thank you everyone. So let's start by going back to what sort of connectivity do we need. So if we look at the developed world, the gold standard connectivity is 5G everywhere and fiber to every home. That's the kind of thing that the European Commission argues for. It's not happening everywhere, but it's the kind of the ideal. Should that be the ideal as well for developing countries, given that it's more expensive to do that than, let's say, 4G and 4G home broadband access, which could perhaps be rolled out more quickly? What do we think? What's the right balance there? Is it to go straight for the best, or is it to actually look at something that's cheaper but can be rolled out faster and more widely? Anyone want to start on that? Maybe Mark.
Yeah.
Since you
so the answer is definitely it depends. Okay. And the first and most key thing we have to remember is affordability, right? If you look at the bottom half in terms of GDP per capita of the world's countries, the spend on telecoms is between $3-7 a month. Okay, so that's what people are able to spend on their telecoms. Now, at those kind of revenue levels, you are never going to be able to afford fiber to a home connection. You will be able to afford some 5G at some point, but operators that are supplying that demand, are balancing that willingness to ability to pay versus the cost of supply. So you inevitably end up with a mix of technologies which is meeting people's basic affordability and willingness to pay. So if you're in a low-income country, and especially if you're in a rural area of a low-income country, people will be delighted if they could get 4G at $5 a month. They would be delighted with that. It would be a big step up from where they are today. In the same countries, in the urban areas, central business districts, there will be people who can afford fiber, and then you get everything in between. And then as you go at the income levels, you'll see a similar pattern, but with the mix changing. And that is the way the market has, what the market has delivered over the last sort of 20 years, and it will continue to do so. And I think we shouldn't be afraid of that, right? That is where the supply is meeting a level of effective demand. If you want to go beyond that and start talking about fiber to people's homes, which is going to cost a lot more than their ability to pay, then somebody's going to have to be subsidizing that. And so where are those subsidies going to come from? And then you immediately start talking about trade-offs between that and other things of public expenditure.
Pamela, Diego, do you think the governments in the developing countries realize that, or do you think that they just rush towards 5G because it sounds good?
I think the policy approach has to change. And in the case of Latin America, with the exception of Chile, and I'm sure that Pamela can explain that because this is a good example what Chile is doing. We have to move from, you know Robin Hood?
Yes.
Yeah, so we have to, what it is happening today in Latin America is the Hood Robin effect, not the Robin Hood, it's the Hood Robin. So the whole policy is making poor to subsidize rich. And so we have to move from the Hood Robin to Robin Hood. And what is that? Mark explained clearly how the system works. You know, the market is concentrated in big cities where people can afford it. But then, if you see the numbers today are really, really, really concerning. In Europe, in the perfect connectivity world, you know, the capex per capita, the investment is about $120 per person.
Yeah.
Whereas in Latin America, the average is about between 25 and 30. Chile is like about 85, so it is a good example. But the thing is that the amount of money being charged by the governments is huge. And that's where the poor people pay. Let me take the example of my own country. So you have a prepaid service because 80% of people have just prepaid because they cannot afford a postpaid plan. So they have to pay 19% tax for value-added tax, 4% additional tax, additional consuming tax that goes for cultural things. And on top of that, in average, they have to pay 15% for universal service fund taxes, and regulation contribution and municipality contributions. So we are talking about almost 40% that goes to the government. And if you see the free cash flow in average in Latin America is just 7-8% of the whole business. So the government is taking, 5-7 times the money that it is ready to be invested in the business.
And that doesn't count probably spectrum auctions and other aspects of
it counts the spectrum auctions there. So we have to change completely the approach. Yeah. When I was a regulator in the 90s, and I had the responsibility to move the country from state-owned monopolies to competition, it was easy to attract investment. So it was actually, many people were interested. And now it is the opposite. With these high interest rates, it is very, very hard to attract investment. So governments have to change completely that policy. Yeah. And we have to make sure that they have the right environment to invest. Yeah. And today, it is the Hood Robin effect, and we have to move to the Robin Hood.
That's a very graphic way of looking at it. So Pamela, how has Chile managed to do better in terms of investment in telecoms?
Yes, it's a question about consistent policy, legal, very strong legal system. Investment companies know that the rules of the games in advance. They're not going to be changed. Consistent policies between different governments, so it's more state policies. And in terms of auction, we don't have auctions itself. We have a beauty contest. Yeah. So that means that we really give the privilege, the focus is in the technical project. For example, when I did a tender for 5G in 4 bands, 3 of them they have to cover at least 90% of the population in time of 2 years. Right. So pretty fast development, and with SLA, quality service of service, and upload and download speed ceilings, and not ceilings, but a floor. So it's a very important, the focus was in the consumer's experience. It's about broad coverage, it's about scalability, it's about cost effectiveness. Yeah. And not only the infrastructure, but also the energy sources. It's about quality of service, it's customization, because not all solutions fits all. There's very different realities within a whole country, and Chile is more about agnostic really with technology, because it depends, as you said. There's no one solution fits all, but it's to have redundancy, of course, it's consistency, and really that most of the people are connected. We have 99% of the population is connected with mobile. Fiber, it was different the case. That's why they conducted 10 public tenders with universal funds. So we, as a government, we fund big part of the capex of the big investments, and we are covering now like 95. It's in construction.
Yeah.
Because of long-term projects, but we're going to be covering 99% of the municipalities. And in just 2018, when I went to the government, they were only being covered 50 out of 346. So a big change in only 5 years.
Yeah, interesting. H, what are we going to do about Papua New Guinea and countries like that?
I'm going to say a few controversial things.
Good.
First, we've got two members. I know the minister very well. I came to Colombia once. And I think there are two excellent examples of what I'd like to see happen in other emerging markets, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and in Southeast Asia. But let's just look at the cost of the revenue economics. In most of these markets that I go to, the ARPUs are between $1, $2 to $8. That's not going to pay for a fiber network anytime soon, right? So there's a clear, significant market failure with those sort of numbers, and governments would have to intervene if you want to build those sort of fiber networks in a big way, because the operators would only build those networks where they really need to build it. That's just the reality. In defense of the operators, I was on the advisory board of a well-known operator across the African continent, and it did not feel sometimes like a mobile business. It felt like a logistics business. You have to worry about kerosene. You have to worry about how many of your base stations are vandalized that weekend. You have to worry about when you go up in the morning. That's what you worry about on a day-to-day basis. So we really need to give some slack to these guys. They're running incredible logistic businesses, trying to get some of these things to work. Most of the base stations are not considered to be critical national infrastructure, which in my view they should be, which has government protection and stuff like that. So that's my defense for the mobile operators, and they're doing the best they can in some of these continents. But I'm harder on the regulators. I genuinely think the regulators are very lazy. It's very lazy regulation that I now see in in emerging markets. The World Bank model that these guys, people like Mark, gave us very clearly of, you know what your access market is, your current access market is, you know what your market efficiency frontier is, and you know what your sustainability frontier is. You go to most of the regulators, these guys have not really sat down at any time to say, my 2G access market is this, my market efficiency frontier for that, if I do put all the regulatory policies in place, can take that 2G from 80% to 90%, and it's only after 90% that they start intervening. Then they move very quickly to the ministers, and the ministers start pouring a lot of monies, which frankly are subsidies that should not really be efficient subsidies, because the regulators should really do their job. So I would like in emerging markets for regulators to be really tasked to do their jobs. I mean, you and I worked for Ofcom, right? We were under a lot of scrutiny every time through Parliament to say, why are you not doing X, why are you not doing Y? I just feel the regulators in most of these emerging market countries really need to be put on their toes.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and maybe it's something we'll come back to. I've often felt that there might be a role for more multinational intervention in regulatory bodies that are not performing as well as they might, but that's a different topic. So staying kind of with the technology side of things, we've talked a lot about the economics, and I mean, it's sort of obvious in a way. If the economics were great, then we wouldn't be having this conversation, because the market would have rolled out the communications systems. Are the economics changing with new technologies? So we can see things like Starlink, obviously used in Ukraine to very good effect, but clearly could be used elsewhere. We are seeing more use now of balloons and drones, not balloons of the loon type, but perhaps tethered balloons that can be used in certain places. We're seeing just the start of the direct-to-handset market with what Apple have been doing with the iPhone 14 and 15, and of course there's many other satellite companies that are looking at that space and starting to think about that space. Are those game changers, or are they just steady incremental improvements on what we've had before? Who wants to take a start on that?
I'll take a start. some of them, the satellite industry has been promising much in emerging markets for all my career in the telecom sector. And it's never really materialized.
Yeah.
And frankly, if you go to sub-Saharan Africa, sometimes when you mention satellite, people get annoyed very quickly.
Yeah.
Right? There was a scenario I found once I went to South Sudan, and I was sitting in a hotel in South Sudan, and those guys were paying in the satellite link something like $3,000 per megabyte per month. Yeah. And that same bird was providing that same service in neighboring Kenya for about $150 to $200 per month.
Why the difference?
Because competition in Kenya with fiber, etc. That's the only price they could get in Kenya. In South Sudan, absolutely nothing. But in normal regulation in a country like this, price regulation would have stopped that problem, right? Nobody's price regulating these guys so in that particular context because they want to get their returns as quickly as possible. And that leaves a pretty bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. Because you know that same bird is providing a service in X at this price and providing the same service in Y at 6x. And that doesn't work. But to answer your question specifically, I think it's really important that some of the new technologies we have seen to chagrin people like you and I with things like TV white spaces and HAPs, they really need to be as close as possible to the current viable ecosystem.
Yeah.
So in that regard, I'm more passionate to see for countries like Colombia, Cameroon, Nigeria, possible solutions like HIPs, high altitude base stations, because it's essentially going to use exactly the same handsets that you and I are using. We're not going to have a big fight between the IMT industry and some other set of manufacturers, because basically in that context, you're just having base stations in the sky rather than having base stations on the ground. And if we end up having base stations in the sky, and if that agenda item 1.4 really proves to be what it promised that is going to happen, that could be a potential game changer. But the other ones, I don't really think they're going to be game changers that quickly.
Yeah.
Because the ecosystem is just not there.
Not there. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah,
you know, when you analyze where the gap is in the case of Latin America, of course, there is people in rural areas, and those kind of solutions are going to help them to be connected. But they are, as Mark mentioned, this is about the supply and demand issue, and basically they cannot afford it. So it could help, you know, government solutions for education or health. It could help for some community centers or whatever, but really it's not going to be that a changer.
Yeah.
And then when you see the real gap today, people who don't have access, they already have the coverage. They are already covered with, you know, 4G services or, you know, not necessarily fiber, but 4G services. So there is, the issue here is that we have to think in a different way, you know, how to approach the problem, and we have to encourage the development of course, the supply side, but also the demand side. How you really encourage the demand side to help us, you know, close the connectivity gap. That's critical.
So is it a problem of affordability where they have coverage, they just can't afford to use it, or is it more than that?
There is a combination of things.
Yeah.
The first one is, of course, affordability, but the second one, the usage. I mean, if you see, for example, on latest polls, we see that, you know, rich people who are well connected, they, so we assess, you know, how people use internet, you know, and basically poor people who are connected, you know, 50% of them, they use internet, just for entertainment and basic communications. Whereas rich people and educated people, you know, people who went to higher education, just 14% of them use for entertainment.
Okay.
So most of the use is to be more productive, to be more educated.
Yeah.
So the thing is, how you really encourage people from low-income segments to use internet in a different way. It is, you know, giving them different incentives to use it. And the problem is that gap is growing, and it grew dramatically with the pandemic. You know, So people, rich people now have more access to knowledge and productivity tools, and they are becoming richer. And poor people are, perhaps they are using technology, but they are not using technology in the right way, and they are getting poorer for that reason.
Hamlet, you wanted to say something on that?
It's about, digital gap is about infrastructure, it's about being able to pay it, but also it's about how do you use it, right? And so we need to work, and that's a public policy, academic, and companies work together to help literacy of the people, because once they don't know how to use it, and when they use it for basic stuff, which doesn't increase or change their level of quality of life. And they don't just as entertainment, they don't study, they don't use it as entrepreneurship. And once you teach them that this tool can help them even getting out of poverty, there's a game changer. Because then they will have a bigger drive in demand, because seriously, they have $5 or $6 or $10 like in Chile to pay for it, but as they don't see the value of it. They don't have any returns of investment on that money neither. Some choose not to be connected. But they spend that in drinks or something else, or tobacco, or food. Food.
Exactly.
So they spend something else, and then so it's a question of teaching them the advantages. And when you have more and more people paying for that infrastructure, there's incentive for companies to invest in better infrastructure. So I think we just need to make sure countries that all the population is covered with multiple technologies, and then at the same time, as we show them how the connectivity, start teaching them, because basically the education level is low in our developed markets. And the people with education knows how to take advantage, and with people without education doesn't know how to use the tools, but not even to think how they can take advantage of it.
And that makes good sense, but that sounds like a really tough challenge. How do you educate a population that probably isn't in education, or perhaps has weak linkage to educational establishments, to do things like that? Is there any good examples of that? Has it worked, or is it just a slow, steady process?
Yeah, we're working in different things. Like to start, when in our countries, there's a lot of even schools that don't have connectivity. For the first time, I was able to connect all schools in Chile. 2,500 schools in Chile have never had connectivity in their lives.
Wow.
Those children are not being grown with connectivity. If they don't have at school, most likely in the house they don't have it either. So they don't know how to use, and when they become 18-year-old kids, men or women, they go to the labor force, and they can't really compete with educated kids that know have their devices since they were born. But also, it's about when we connected schools, the teachers didn't know how to teach with connectivity. So there's a lot of programs, and also to help teachers upscale and rescale their teaching abilities, and be prepared for kids that they can learn in 1 month. They can already know 10 times more than they do. But also it's about teaching ordinary people how to use and be connected, how to use technology. So and the Minister of Education, someone else in the previous panel, the Minister of Education had a big say in this. And that's important that the Minister of Education is really understand technology and understand economy from pro, because if not, they're concerned about progressing education the way it used to be, and the world, as you said, change forever, and everything changed. So there has to be direct policy from education, from social development, from academic, everywhere, and people need to understand that without technology, as you're a lawyer, doctor, architect, you need that as a basic now.
Absolutely. Mark, do you think the World Bank and others understand that kind of dynamic?
I think they understand it in principle.
Okay.
I think it's very difficult to do anything in practice. I just want to go back to the earlier point. We started off on technology and talking about satellites. Actually, I think a thing that's had a much bigger effect on access to connectivity is fiber in developing countries. And I'm not talking about the FTTH, the access networks, but it's everything from the submarine cables through to long-haul terrestrial and then backhaul. And that really has revolutionized the economics of broadband, mobile broadband, because it's just reduced the cost. And H's example of South Sudan versus Kenya is a perfect illustration of something that happens all over, certainly all over Africa. And what happens is as the fiber networks penetrate into the interior, then satellite prices collapse, which is exactly the way you want the market to work. But I think, so some of those problems have been solved, especially for the coastal countries where submarine cables have landed. But there's still a huge gap on the interior, and both landlocked countries, but then also within countries. Governments don't make it very easy for fiber operators to lay fiber and operate fiber networks. They do make all sorts of decisions, policy and tax and other kinds of regulation decisions, which makes life difficult for them. And so I think if you were going to try and do one thing as a government to try and improve connectivity outside the immediate confines of the mobile market, you would look at that and fix that. It would make a big impact.
So you're absolutely right, but we still have a big problem in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia, where all the big guys these guys are still single-digit percentage usage of those pipes, right? So there are terabytes of capacity coming into those countries. But the usage is minuscule because there's no built national backbones actually to distribute and use that fiber across the country. And that just requires public policy to drive that, but that requires monies. And it's quite tricky for governments. I don't know how the two ministers here managed it in their countries, but it's something that we really need, those fiber backbones.
We need to have regulatory reforms with a view that I think permitting process and cost of it are there. Every municipality until have different requirements, different knowledge.
Yeah.
So you need to have something that really is more standard. But also, even in the tender or policy, any policy has to really, everything you do as a regulator has to be with a mindset that needs free market to work as its best. That will lower prices. That will increase competition. That will have the diminished market entries. As many players you have, the consumers will receive the benefits of it. And you also, as a regulator, need to really try to be flexible, because sometimes law, to get into the Congress to change a law will take years, but you have the sandboxes, regulator sandboxes to allow in certain different business models, different technology like TV white space that you mentioned, to try to be trial, and we use that in Chile to see what is really the benefit, what is the cost, how much interference they will have. So you really have to be flexible, cognitively flexible enough to be trying different things, and also to be data-driven regulator. So make decisions on basis and be able to say, listen, we measured this, we did, we're gonna change it because it didn't work, or will work better if we do this other change. So have to be really flexible, and that, as you said, requires a lot of work.
You have to.
So you have to be really attentive of what the needs are, how things are changing, and be proactive, and really be proactive about it.
And it's always such a difficult balance between intervening in a market and at the same time maintaining competition in that market, because almost inevitably whenever you intervene, you impact the competitive dynamics of the market. And I think that's something even developed countries are seeing. Here in the UK, we've got intervention in the rural network that's being built at the moment, where government is paying for half of it and so on, and that changes dynamics. I mean, to come back to the fibre point, which I think is an important one, should governments just go ahead and build fibre backbones to all major towns and cities, or should that be something competitive? What's the right approach?
I think it's just crazy that I still go to so many African countries, or even to Papua New Guinea, and you're building a road and you're not just putting in fibre at the center.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I really, the amount of time I have arguments with ministers, and the only excuses I get is that somehow the Ministry of Transport cannot speak to the Ministry of Communications. That's basically what it comes down to. It is just crazy.
Yeah.
I don't know why the president just doesn't sit over that. They spend all their time in Geneva and in New York talking about sustainable development goals and then come back home and can't coordinate two departments. Just crazy. And we really need to call a spade in some of these countries that you go to, because we just can't continue like that. One of the things that I've just learned from the two ministers here, which I think is really helping in Latin America, I go to some Latin American countries, is that they do look at both the access failure problem as well as the demand side failure problem as well as the supply side failure problem. The one which is the biggest will always constrain the problem, right? So if you go to a country in Africa, I don't want to name and shame it, where they've got 93% broadband, 3G broadband coverage, so in terms of population, theoretically, they've got 93% people who can have access to the internet, right? But they only have 43%. So there's a 50% access problem, affordability problem. I can excuse them for some of that because some of that is just illiteracy. So you can take the 20% that is illiteracy. So they really should be able to connect 73% of the people. But that country has got some of the biggest taxes on the continent, at something like 48% total taxes that they take from the sector. And they are surprised why people are not able to use services. So they really need to look at both the access side problems and the supply side problems, and then look for a collaborative way to work with that, like what she did in Chile, where she went to schools and then started addressing some of those problems with schools. By you doing that, you were addressing some of the demand side challenges. And in many markets I see across the low developing countries, they just don't think about it in that structured way.
What's your view, Mark? I remember when we were looking at 5G, the availability of fibre was one of the key determinants of whether it's the right approach or not.
I mean, your question was, should governments do this? And it's a real tricky one, because if you look at it on paper, you think, well, it doesn't make sense in a marginal market or marginal areas of the country for multiple operators trying to build their own fibre. I mean, that looks crazy. But then when you look at examples of where governments have built their own fibres, the political economy, takes over, and you end up with a worse outcome. And there's plenty of examples in Africa where governments have built their own backbone networks and then blocked other operators from investing because they need to recover their investments. So the political, H's description of the Ministry of Communications and Ministry of Transport, it sounds ridiculous that this, but that is the reality in most countries.
I could believe it in the UK, frankly.
Right, exactly. And and as Pamela says, it takes a long time to get legislation through. It also takes a long time, possibly forever, to get the two ministers to cooperate with each other. You just have to accept that as a reality, and you've got to come up with workarounds. So having the private sector building fibre networks may look suboptimal from a efficiency point of view, but actually it usually gets better results quicker. And if you can get the operators to cooperate with each other in joint ventures, that's a great outcome if you can make that happen. And there are examples of where that's worked.
We have a good example in Colombia. A few years ago, we deployed the backbone, the fiber backbone, and now we are connected 100% of municipalities. You have to understand that Colombia, the size of Colombia is, France, Spain, and Portugal combined. So it is and it was a successful project because we deployed fiber very, very fast to connect municipalities, small municipalities. It was an auction, CapEx auction, and we were lucky that two companies really got excited in the auction. But then the problem is the last mile. How you get to the town with the fiber, and what to do in the last mile? No big operator wants to go to a small town because it is not profitable at all. So what we did was opening the network. So in the auction, one of the rules was that network has to be open, and there was a mandatory offer, and basically we encourage local people, local engineers or technicians, to provide services with microwave radios, unlicensed radios. Today we have almost 4,000 of those operators covering small towns and rural areas. It is a very, very successful case. That's good. But now the challenge we have is we are ready to launch 5G, but we don't have the capillarity of fiber we need.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge, how to do it.
Yeah.
And in a government that thinks that the money should go to state-owned operators rather than private operators. So they want to give it to state-owned operators. So it is a challenge on how to do it. And basically, how you make sure that they do the job and they don't come back later saying, oh, this business, is not profitable enough. I'm not covering even OPEX. And because it is happening already of a few projects that we've done and said, if I don't get a monthly subsidy, I'm not able to do it. Mm. So one of the key elements is how you make those projects sustainable in the long run. That's one of the elements that we have to look at.
And do you think things like the microwave links is actually a problem in the long term, in that you've provided some kind of connectivity, so it's hard then to justify developing replacing that with a fiber if you've already got something? Is that a...
Yeah, but that's for rural areas and for small municipalities. And I think those operators, entrepreneurs, those entrepreneurs, they're fine.
Do you want some water?
Sorry. The problem is in main cities.
Yeah. Oh, you have some. Top you up.
The problems are in main cities, in low income areas in main cities. We've run a lot of programs giving subsidies that cover OPEX, but once the subsidies are gone, operators say, I have to stop the service.
Yeah.
And that's a huge issue. And that's a huge social issue, because once people have the service and they are cut off, that's a social
absolutely. So just going back to something Pamela mentioned a while back, so one solution, particularly to areas that are very poorly connected, is to bring connectivity into a central point, like a school or whatever, and then have Wi-Fi there that's obviously available to those in the school, but available potentially to anyone else who wants to come there. And we've seen many of those kind of things, either sponsored by governments or in some cases by charities or sort of companies that are focused on that kind of area. Is that a good solution, or is that actually just sort of half fulfilling a need that then never gets fully fulfilled after it? What's your thoughts, Pamela, on that?
I think perfection is the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
So you have to go. You don't start running a marathon from zero. So you go step in the right way. Each step will lead you into the next step. So that's a solution. Fixed wireless, satellite to telephones. I mean, everything, because again, when you build the mass and the people start using it and learning how to use it, will increase. It will become a virtuous circle.
Yeah.
So one step at a time in the right direction. Hopefully, there are many steps at a time. So, but yes, totally, nothing is about the solution. Everything needs to be assessed.
Yeah.
But in the long-term planning, it's not that you're like, okay, you have one level of connectivity, 50 mega download, and you're happy forever. No. Yeah. You have to have scalability and long-term planning to increase that connectivity level.
Yeah. So it's just the starting point of
exactly.
building on things. Yeah.
I think Diego's point, example of the small Wi-Fi operators, I think is a great example of how you can extend reach out into low-income communities. Because they're profit-making enterprises, so they only exist if they can make a profit. But because you've basically the core upstream infrastructure is already there, and the cost of Wi-Fi is extremely low, you can actually make profit at a micro enterprise level there. And those, I think, are much more sustainable and also expandable. I mean, unlimited amounts of scalability. I'm a little skeptical about the public Wi-Fi model. I think it works, in sophisticated countries like Chile and Colombia, but if you go down the income scale, down the sort of technocratic capabilities, those end up just not being sustainable. So I think a model where you try and make it as easy as possible for the private sector to supply at the lowest possible price points is one that's going to get you a solution that works in the long run.
Yeah.
But what happens if the market failure is so entrenched?
Well, you and I can have a discussion about a definition of market failure, but people not being able to afford something is not a market failure. That just means they can't afford it. A market failure is when you get, when the market is structured in a way which it's not meeting demand which they would otherwise meet. So there are examples of where you get, one operator dominating a market and pushing prices up. Or you get some markets where you've got two, a cozy duopoly, prices are sky high. That's a market failure. But if you've got a very effectively competitive market, the government's not excessively taxing the industry, and still there are segments of the population that can't afford it, I wouldn't describe that as a market failure. I would
What about
describe
the
that as a
example from
development
Minister
challenge.
Diego, where he's done a very good job. He's now auctioned all the different areas. These guys have now run out of OPEX, and they're basically creating social problems for him by not providing services. That's the claim.
Yeah, I mean, that's the risk of public subsidies into the sector, right? It creates complications which may be unforeseen.
Right.
And that's done in Colombia, and that's one of the best models. This is
a
a
very good
model
model.
that's been, presented to many countries. So I would say, in a sense, that's a great example to have out there, but it's not really representative of what most governments are capable of delivering.
So we've got about 15 minutes left. I'm keen to broaden it to others. Luca, do we have any questions from outside? We have one here. Excellent. Just the microphone is coming your way. Let us know who you are and where you're from. That's always helpful.
Thank you.
I think it
it works.
Fantastic.
Thank you. My name is Tola Onayemi. I'm digital trade advisor with the AFCFTA via Trademark Africa, and previously assistant chief negotiator for Nigeria. And excited to be here. I'm Nigerian by background. A number of questions, and I think a number of them are around the question of costs. So I think the first question for me is, and this comes up a lot on the work I do on the continent. We talk about 5G and Wi-Fi, and it's great. Today, when you think of mobile, and the impact on emerging economies, today when you think about mobile money payment, right, sub-Saharan Africa contributes about 80% now to mobile money payments on the continent. And that's because of things like M-Pesa, where you can use USSD codes to make payments. Yep. But interestingly, in e-commerce, it's ridiculously low, less than 5%. And the fundamental reason is one thing, phones. People use low-quality phones on the continent. So it's great to talk about Wi-Fi and 5G, but the big question for telcos is who's going to use them? How many people have the quality of phones to actually make use of those things on the continent? And so the big question is, you talk about Wi-Fi and 5G and what it can do for connectivity. But the first thing is, even for commercial activities, people don't have the mobile devices to be able to take use of like the 2Gs and 3Gs that already exist on the continent today. So the big question is, what should we be doing to jumpstart from that point where we have internet connectivity and there are no quality of phones that people can use to actually start to make productive activities like you talked about on the continent, and they're only using for like mobile money payments today. The second side to that question is some of the things you mentioned, which is for countries today and telcos, right, one of the big questions for them is the question of costs, right? How much investment do I have to do to be able to build out 5G on the continent? The question is, if I can't get a critical mass, and you talk about that, of people using these things on the continent, what's the incentive for me to invest that much money today in trying to do that? One of the things I did when I was at the Nigerian presidency was try to crash the cost of right-of-way, right, between countries. But even when you crash that, the big argument still most of them ask is, what's the market size and market demand that necessitates making those kind of investments? Especially when in cases where they actually even need it for economic activities, they can't do it because of the quality of phones that they have. Just my first question.
Interesting thoughts. So, Diego.
I have also a good example in Colombia about the terminals. When I was a minister, terminals were quite taxed. It's very expensive. So I went to negotiate with the Minister of Finance. Who is the head? I mean, who is the head? I mean, period. And that's the issue. We have to train, we have to educate ministers of finance to understand the power of technology in the productivity of the country. And I did that. So I went to him and I told him, look, we have to eliminate all kind of taxes for terminals. He said, no, that's a lot of money. Intel helped me with a study showing the impact. And we tracked that impact for 4 years. It was positive. To the taxman, it was very, very positive, eliminating the taxes. So the goal was to have the cheapest terminals in the whole continent, and we did it. And it was a boom in terms of terminals. But that's not enough. That's not enough because, and then of course, governments have to spend money, for example, giving terminals to students in public schools, and that's a must. That's a critical issue in terms of trying to reduce the cost of terminals. And today in Latin America, in general terms, that problem is solved. The penetration of smartphones is more than 90%. It is solved. But then that's when the demand side is really, really important, to make sure that people have access to applications that transform their lives. In the case of your mobile payments, it is huge, the transformation of the region thanks to the fintech world. It is fantastic because the opportunity was there, and companies and entrepreneurs are investing a lot and making people use it for different services. And in terms of e-commerce, we don't have any. It is growing dramatically. Last year, e-commerce in the region grew more than 20%. So it is working, not as fast as I wanted, but it is working.
H, what have you seen in Africa?
I'll just, you ask a very important question, but our continent is complicated, right? So to get e-commerce working in Africa is, I say on the continent all the time, and I've chaired a whole big group of about 20 ministers in Tanzania to try and pull together an e-commerce culture in Tanzania. To me, to get e-commerce to work, you need 3 important platforms. The first platform is the connectivity platform. At least let people be connected to one another. The second is the identity platform. You go to Africa, all of us have got about 6 different identities, and we don't have a unique identity. I don't want to go onto a platform where you've got one identity and then another platform you've got another identity, and I buy something from you and it gets delivered to me and I don't like it and I can't trace who you are, okay? So we need to solve the identity problem. And then the last is what you're referring to, which is the payments platform. So we need to get all of those 3 platforms working. And in practically most countries in Africa, we're nowhere near addressing the identity issue. Again, it sits in different departments. Identity issue sits in the Home Affairs Department. The payments platform sits in the Central Bank. Connectivity sits in the Ministry of ICT. Never a twain shall meet. Okay? So you would hear a big constant theme of coordination across ministries and departments across the African continent until we get our ministers to start seriously thinking about doing that coordination. We're just going to be spinning our wheels. We really are.
Can I add something? I agree with everything that H said. I mean, and this problem that you've identified is hugely, but I think there's a solution which is a partnership between the government doing what they're supposed to do, fixing the problems that H has just described, and then the private sector coming in and supplying credits. I mean, if we think about it, all of us, living in higher income countries, none of us buy our smartphones for cash. Everyone buys it on credit through the mobile phone plans. So, the same solution should be applied in developing countries. You need a consumer credit ecosystem which can supply those phones. And that doesn't exist in most low-income countries. There are examples, like Kenya is pioneering this. There are companies setting up, consumer credit companies setting up. But they need the public infrastructure that H has just described in order to make that work. And the Ministry of Finance has a role here in making sure the regulations around consumer credit and consumer financing are appropriate to that kind of microcredit. All of those are sort of doable. None of those feel like insurmountable problems, right? And it's a win for everyone. The government wins, the customer wins, the private sector wins. So I think,
yes.
Yeah.
But then another issue that I forgot to mention is that your example about e-commerce is again opening widening the gap. Why? Because e-commerce is being taken advantage of big companies and foreign companies. So you see the consumers of Colombia buying a lot of stuff imported or produced by big companies, but SMEs are losing sales because they are not into e-commerce, because they don't have the knowledge, again, they are not trained to do that, and they don't have the logistics to do that, and it is growing the gap that was mentioned in the previous panel between the big companies and the SMEs.
Any other questions from anyone here? Okay, one over there. The microphone's just coming up behind you.
Great. Good afternoon. Onika Makwakwa with the Global Digital Inclusion Partnership, formerly known as the Alliance for Affordable Internet. So my question is with regards to those who are unconnected right now. And we know, for example, in Africa that a majority of them are in rural areas. In fact, the rural-urban divide is becoming even wider. So some of the comments here about the divides that are emerging amongst those who are connected already. But let's go back to rural areas. So in Africa, we have certain areas where mobile operators have actually said it is commercially not viable for them to provide services there. And there's been the innovation that has come with community-owned networks that are looking at using different technology, but also looking at a different financial model, which is what we need now for those that are said to be in areas that are commercially not viable. However, there has been a lot of resistance towards enabling community networks, at least in Africa there is. And I think my question is this now time for regulators in particular to step in and create a policy and a regulatory environment that, will look at a different financial model to enable community networks or other similar innovations? Because if we accept that we are digitizing as a society, we are now looking at excluding more than half of the population in the continent from a digitized economy. We already have an economy that many would describe as quite violent towards the poor. And I think my greatest fear is that if we don't do something to actually enable communities that are in these areas to be able to be connected regardless of their ability to pay, because this affordability issue is actually a big challenge around why people are not online. And this is not just affordability of the connectivity itself, even though community networks are addressing that. When you look at the terminals in Africa, we are spending about 40 to 60% of average household GDP in GDI in order to buy a terminal. Yeah. That's how much it costs for me to purchase a small household appliance that services the entire household for just one device for one person. And so I think I'm just saying this to say, is it time for us to now think about it from a very different financial model? That maybe it is not profit, maybe we look at it as a utility, and just gets our regulators. I really love the comment you made, Aish, about regulators being just lazy, because I feel that regulation has really failed us so far in terms of what needs to happen. 5G, really great. There's so much that you can do with it. But I'm not sure if 5G is going to resolve the issue of the unconnected. And so how do we really address this gap? Looking at all the different technologies, but also being open to the fact that it may just take a different financial model that's not just about the market.
Thoughts on that? Should we have something quite different for unconnected rural areas?
I think, but first of all, I need to acknowledge the work that FOAI and GDIP, you guys have done some fantastic work, and thank you for. I read all your reports voraciously to get an understanding of. Look, you're asking a $64,000 question there. I've worked in markets on the continent where we have tried to create that regulatory environment, but we saw a second dynamic that we did not anticipate, which is our brothers and sisters who are entrepreneurs would rather not do it in the villages. They would rather do it in the cities. And no matter how much we try and encourage them to go to the villages, it's always sexier to do it in the villages. Then we also found another dynamic, which is don't underestimate, I like the word that you use, the word utilities. Don't underestimate the fact that communications is an important utility right now, but so is water, okay? And so is electricity, and so is fuel. And so you go to my grandmother's village, if you're giving her a chance, you give her $10, she'd rather spend it to get clean water first, because they've not provided fantastic water facilities there than to provide that communication. So that communication is now a distant second, and we have that. So this problem has been worrying me for many years. So I came up with an idea some years back where I called it civilization in a box, which is, what if I have one infrastructure which gives me connectivity, which gives me water, and which provides electricity and can provide other services? Because the whole idea that we can have different networks in these areas where there's clear market failure for all these network industries, and we're going to have individual networks for electricity, which is going to pay for itself, for gas, which is going to pay for itself, for water, which is going to pay for itself, is for the birds. So I want people at the World Bank to start thinking about how you have an infrastructure. And so we tested this. So we worked with some guys who got a big container, right? You know the containers that we ship to Africa. We put a lot of batteries in there and inverters. We took it to Mauritania. We worked with a British company. And we took it to Mauritania, and we connected about 20 homes onto that battery set, because Mauritania is highly irradiated, fantastic in Mauritania. Then we got this dream idea, because the batteries were all charged by 4 p.m. The batteries were all charged. So we brought water aid from London, and water aid came there, and we dug a borehole, and then we now produce a second service. So we pumped water now into tanks. So using that infrastructure, now we could provide electricity and we could provide water. Then we now started providing mobile services, and it was paid for by the chief in that village. And we need those sort of creative models to say, look, we want the same civilization that we see in the cities, in those places, but we're not going to have separate infrastructures to pay for them. The economics does not work. So can we find ways of merging the infrastructure? So just Google civilization in a box and Google my name. And if you can convince the World Bank, and take the idea and run with it. I don't want it. I just want us to think more creatively as to how we solve these significant entrenched market failure problems in various markets that we work in.
Thank you, H. Anyone else want to chip in on that one?
I think there are several things which when you actually look at what governments are actually doing, they say they want connectivity in rural areas, but they're actually making quite decisions that do the opposite. So Diego mentioned tax. That's the biggest thing.
Yeah, that's true.
All of the prices that the customers are paying, 40% of that is tax in many countries. So that'd be one thing immediately you could address. The other thing is around, which is something that everyone's very familiar with, is spectrum auctions with coverage obligations in them right now. Actually, the coverage obligations in many countries, spectrum licenses, are actually quite modest. And the reason, that's not by accident. That's because the governments know that the bigger the coverage obligation, the lower the revenue they're going to get from the auctions. And once the license has been auctioned, it's very difficult to do anything about it. You know, then you get all these subsidy systems that work retrospectively. The most simple and most effective cross-subsidy mechanism is coverage obligations within licenses. So, you know, there are cases where governments have put quite extensive coverage obligations. I mean, South Africa in the recent 5G spectrum auctions had pretty aggressive coverage obligations. That's very effective. But so you could do those things. Neither of those two things are simple, because that's all money into the treasury versus customers. They're not politically simple, but they're pretty straightforward. So governments, I think, if they're really serious about getting connectivity into rural areas, there's some things definitely they could do about it.
And I think that pretty much brings us to the end of our session, actually.
Thank you very much.
So, I mean, it's been fascinating. Actually, before I started, I assumed that we'd be talking more about the pure technologies of delivering connectivity. But actually, I think what's come out is that's a small piece of the puzzle, and there's a much, much bigger piece around education, around around applications that then drives the demand to use things, and around all sorts of issues that then filter into identity and payments and other things. All of those have to kind of be in place to allow for the demand to materialize, which results in the overall payment system. And that's really difficult to do, because that involves coordinated government, which, as we've heard, is pretty challenging for everyone. So a big thank you to everyone on the panel. And I'll hand back to Marianne.